creating an emulator. Creating an emulator is a very easy step, but at the same time very important. Sorry. But before that, think about that. What is exactly Android emulator? Android emulator is just a replacement of your real phone device. So if you don't have a real Android phone device to test your application, you can create an Android emulator into your desktop, inside your Eclipse itself, and test all your Android phones. And it's pretty close, I would say 98 to 99% close to the real phone. So Android emulator is a virtual device which everyone uses to test and develop their application for the actual Android phone. And it is called Android virtual device or emulator, all are same word. So it doesn't matter what is the word you use, but Android emulator. So emulator, somebody will say Android virtual device, somebody will say, but it is same thing. So it doesn't matter. Now let us see how we create the Android emulator. And before that, maybe it is a good idea to talk a little bit about Android emulator, and then we'll see that how to create the emulator. Okay, so let me just see where we are. So Android emulator, before I create a few things to understand, it is a virtual device on which you can run your Android applications without having the real physical mobile device. So without having the real physical mobile device. This emulator is configured using one of the Android system image. And this is what I am talking about. It could be 2.3, 3.0, 4.0, anything. Distributed in the SDK. The system image is exactly the same as one on the real mobile hardware device. Generally, you run the emulator from inside Eclipse, but you can run it from command prompt as well. To close the emulator, just close the emulator application, but don't do it unless there is an issue. One important thing, very important. Do not keep closing the emulator and reopening the emulator every time you need to reinstall an application. Emulator is very smart, and if you are running an application and developing an application and you made some changes and you want to reinstall, it will override the same application and it will run the latest ones. But if you try to close the emulator application, restart again install, it takes a lot of time. So unless the emulator has crashed or hanged, which it happens, do not close the emulator application. Just keep saying that run the application, install the application, it will do fine. There are some limitations of emulator, like you cannot make a phone call, although you can simulate making a phone call. Nobody can call you back in your emulator, but you can simulate somebody calling in your emulator and develop an application. So there are few real things which you cannot do, but there is a simulated way to do that. But other than those couple of things, everything else works just like real. So just assume that your emulator is as good as it. And more you develop the emulator applications, you will understand this. Now, how do you create a new emulator? These are the commands, but let me just show you in the real world by creating one. So let us go and create one emulator. Here I will go, and to create the emulator, you need to click something called AVD Manager, that is Emulator Manager, or Android Virtual Device Manager. And I have already created few emulators, but let us create one more. So I will click New and give some name, whatever name you want to give. Generally, I start with AVD and give the name of the version for which I am doing it, but you can give any name you want. Let us create one for 2.2 or 231. let me see which one is. uh, I have 231. So Android 231 API level 9. Okay. Now after this, you leave here, don't do anything, and here I am putting 231. Here is the SD card size. It is like the on a real phone you will have a SD card, and it is in MB. So generally I give 100 MB. Don't leave it blank. That is the problem which will happen if you are developing an application which is trying to write on the SD card of your emulator. So don't leave it blank. Give 100 to 200 MB. And rest of the thing, I just leave it as it is. Don't worry about all that. We'll figure out later. And create AVD. So this has created a AVD 231. Now to see that whether this emulator has really working or not, you can just click start this emulator AVD 231. It will say this, just say launch data, and it will create a emulator. So you can close this window and see that how it works. So it is launching the emulator. Let us see. Now this has launched the emulator, and once you launch the emulator, you are pretty much done with the final step called CreateEmulator. And this brings us to a point where we can say that setup is ready and we are ready to go with start development. So finally our setup to start Android development is ready. In case you are having trouble with Android development environment, please refer the detailed document at this one, which tells you what exactly to do. So that brings us to a point where we are complete with the state setup.